In the summer of the war, when the fronts were still in a feverish state and the skies of Europe were darkened by the smoke and fumes of explosions, in the mysterious corners of the Reich military apparatus, threads of ideas and projects were gathering like a poisonous and viscous sap. Ideas that were not only supposed to strengthen the artillery and infantry, but was supposed to transform the very concept of war. These were projects that were called in the documents under the general title of Wunderweapons or Wunderwaffe, a name that, above all, carried the promise of a miracle that could reverse the trend of repeated defeats and restore the regime's declining political credibility. These ideas originated in the highest-level think tanks, in headquarters and command offices, where plans and supply schedules were kept side by side. But in practice, they relied most heavily on a vast network of research institutes, workshops, universities, and forced labor. A network that spun its webs like a spider in basements and caves. In the sequences that the black and white archives have left behind, the first shots show large workshops and assembly halls, high ceilings, metal columns, and rows upon rows of workbenches where engineers, technicians, and workers were busy. Heavy machinery, aluminum and steel sheets, molds, and special jacks all had a mysterious appearance in the harsh light of industrial lamps, images that record both scientific progress and human deprivation and poverty. The employees in the same frames are a combination of scientists with serious faces and lines of fatigue on their foreheads, and workers with calloused hands and looks that sometimes indicate terror and sometimes indifference. Workers, many of whom were taken from among the hostages of war and forced laborers, and silently participated in a process that determined their fate without giving them anything. These research centers were moved to protected basements and tunnels in different layers, especially during the period when Allied bombing intensified. The few films and photographs of these underground centers sometimes show key rooms, dark spaces, filled with metal cabinets, tables filled with delicate measuring instruments, electromechanical devices with cables that clung to the walls like great veins. In these confined environments, the time and psychological pressure on researchers and workers was doubly heavy. Shortages of raw materials, frequent power outages, and the threat of aerial bombardment meant that work was done in emergency conditions and often of substandard quality. The texture of these images, while promising scientific progress, reveals in every frame traces of the ethics that have turned scientific research into an instrument of political power. Within these collections, several fundamental axes of Nazi endeavor were discernible. Axes that each were accompanied by a specific mythologizing in the context of the regime's official and semi-official propaganda. The first and best known of these was the missile program, an attempt to convey the concepts of long-range firing and pinpoint strikes on targets deep inside enemy territory. Film archives of launch bases, concrete platforms, and missiles with long, slender bodies are illustrative of this desire. The images reveal the immense silence that prevailed before the test explosions. More than simply pursuing launch engineering, the project was also a show of national power, a declaration that the regime had the power to break through distances. However, historical documents and post-war analyses have revealed that the program was costly in terms of both human and material resources, heavily dependent on extensive infrastructure, and would require time and resources beyond the war-torn German capacity to truly realize its strategic impact. Along with missiles, another area in which huge investments were made was the development of aircraft and jet engines, though these projects were also pursued as a shadow of the Reich's scientific ideology. Jets embodied the idea of a transition from conventional speeds to new scales of motion, and factory films capture images of giant wings and engines spinning in assembly halls. But in these views, it was not without its limitations and operational needs. Fuel shortages, difficulties in mass production, and complete vulnerability to supply attacks all prevented these projects from achieving the speed needed to change the course of the war. What remains is the gap between the promise of new technology and the reality of war on the ground, a gap that is well illustrated in the dry archival footage. Submarines, especially U-boats, were also part of the desperate effort to recreate German superiority at sea. Photographic evidence of the docks and the outgoing submarines shows a relentless effort to cut off the enemy's supply lines. Some of the documents record secret efforts to increase dive time and employ new navigation and electronic warfare technologies. But even there, the limitations and reactions of the Allies in the anti-diving system, with the improvement of radar and listening consoles, greatly slowed down the pace of these plans. Thus, although at first glance they symbolized a great threat, in practice, these projects also revealed the technological power and complementary military will of the enemy. Any military innovation is vulnerable to the blade of a counter-reaction. Another dark side of the secret programs was the attempt to guide and automate weapons, a topic that today is presented in the form of more precise control and guidance, but at that time appeared in a more primitive and at the same time dangerous form. Early guided weapons, nascent radio tracking and control systems, and experimental designs for guided bombs represented a new trend in warfare, one that sought to minimize human error at the cost of enormous technical and infrastructural costs. Film archives show workbenches littered with wires, panels, and measuring equipment, manuscripts that represented the first theoretical and practical stirrings for the remote control of instruments of destruction. What post-war historical documents have repeatedly emphasized is the lack of practical effectiveness of most of these efforts in the short term, and the lack of an appropriate ethical and scientific framework for such technologies. Along with the advances in weapons technology, there were also plans to create massive armored vehicles and super-heavy tanks, machines whose symbolic purpose was to exert psychological influence on the enemy, as in some images of assembly lines which show huge skeletons that have not yet been completed. These projects were often more symbolic than practical, ideas that seemed suitable for a show of power on parade grounds or in official propaganda, but in real implementation they encountered numerous problems such as excessive weight, transportation difficulties, and unacceptable fuel consumption. The industrial symbolism of these projects was more important than their military effectiveness, a sign of how political hegemony could divert the direction of research and production from practical needs in the field. Behind all these workshops and laboratories, however, lies a part of the story that is rarely seen in official accounts: the cheap or forced labor that powered the projects. The forced labor camps and centers were part of the secret weapons production chain. Post-war documents and images have made it clear that many of these efforts were based on the work of teams working in inadequate conditions, without labor protection, and exposed to various abuses. In addition to the direct human consequences, this also affected the final quality of the products and the robustness of the projects, as the anxious and exhausted workforce was unable to perform accurate and continuous work. Another side of this narrative is the role of information and electronic warfare in secret projects. Radio rooms, listening devices, and the effort to encrypt and break enemy codes all came together to form part of this vast effort. In fact, the effort to disable enemy communications and secure our own emerged as a new front in the war, one in which wires and radio waves became as important as bullets and cannons. Images of radio operators, pages full of numbers and graphs, and electronic test boxes show how quickly this field became part of the regime's secret military production, a field that also had grave moral and social consequences. At the end of this first part, what remains most striking is the contrast between dream and reality. The black and white documents that record the workshops, bases, and intertwined phases of these projects present a dual picture. On the one hand, a high-profile picture of the effort to overcome technological boundaries, and on the other, a reflection of the human costs, strategic errors, and practical limitations. Although the secret weapons projects have brilliant appearances in the military history of World War II, if we look closely, they are more than anything a retelling of a historical lesson: that technological research, without ethical frameworks and without regard to human and logistical realities, can lead to the production of tools that not only do not have the expected efficiency, but also impose irreparable costs on families, society, and the political space. The black and white frames of this chapter, now after many years, are an invitation to reflection and warning, an invitation to read history not as a praise of technique, but as a bitter statement about the consequences of the union of science and power. In the second part, the story descends into the depths of that industrial darkness, where war no longer takes place on the front lines and among soldiers, but in underground tunnels, stone tunnels, and vast halls hidden from the world. In the Harz Mountains, deep in the cold rocks, a project was formed that later became known as the codename Mittelbau. There, thousands of prisoners of war and forced laborers were employed day and night in conditions beyond human endurance to build the V-2 rockets. The narrator, as if looking through shadows, describes this underground world. Tunnels soaked with moisture, the smell of metal and sweat wafting through the air, dim lights flickering through the mist of steam on the concrete ceilings, and the sound of hammers beating like a living heartbeat in the heart of the earth. In every corner, thin bodies, bent over from cold and fatigue, move slowly. Heavy machinery lifts half-finished rocket parts through smoke and steam. The cold atmosphere of the tunnels is full of contrasts. Somewhere, science and engineering. In the second part, the story descends into the depths of that industrial darkness, where war no longer takes place on the front lines and among soldiers, but in underground tunnels, stone tunnels, and vast halls hidden from the world. In the Harz Mountains, deep in the cold rocks, a project was formed that later became known as the code name Mittelbau. There, thousands of prisoners of war and forced laborers were employed day and night in conditions beyond human endurance to build the V-2 rockets. The narrator, as if looking through shadows, describes this underground world. Tunnels soaked with moisture, the smell of metal and sweat wafting through the air, dim lights flickering through the mist of steam on the concrete ceilings, and the sound of hammers beating like a living heartbeat in the heart of the earth. In every corner, thin bodies, bent over from cold and fatigue, move slowly. Heavy machinery lifts half-finished rocket parts through smoke and steam. The cold atmosphere of the tunnels is full of contrasts. Somewhere, science and engineering work at the highest level, and a few meters away, humans have been reduced to consumer tools. The narrator sees how German scientists in the upper laboratories are busy with diagrams and formulas, while in the lowest part, humans fall to their knees from hunger and dry coughs. This dual image is the hidden heart of the Reich's secret projects, where science is put at the service of survival, but the price is human souls. One day, a whisper passes among the workers, a whisper of a rocket crashing during the test phase. They say that during the launch, the trajectory was deviated and the rocket crashed into the forest. A rumor spreads that the cause is a fuel shortage, or perhaps sabotage. Someone tampered with the calculations. In a dark corner of the tunnel, the narrator hears the rapid breathing of a young worker, trembling with fear. Something between hope and terror flickers in his eyes, as if he knows that the discovery of this sabotage will bring collective punishment. In the heavy silence, the sound of drops falling from the ceiling, and then the shout of a guard running through the corridors breaks the air. Hours later, a group of SS officers enter through the main entrance. Their boots clatter on the damp floor and echo along the walls. They pass by the rows of workers, without a word, but there is a threat in their silence. That day, several workers are arrested without explanation. No one dares to ask. The narrator only sees them from afar as they are led through the tunnels, the light of the lamps flickering on their faces before fading into darkness. The work continues, unceasing, silent, unceasing, as if life in this underground world no longer has any meaning other than production. Above ground, at the same moment, other factories are working on related projects. At the Peenemünde base, engineers have revised plans spread out on large tables. The air is cold, and beyond the windows, the Baltic Sea is calm. But the calm is false.
Allied reconnaissance planes have passed overhead many times, and the possibility of an air raid is increasing every day. From afar, through the words of the survivors' memories, the narrator sees how the engineers hide the fatigue and anxiety in their faces. They know that any small mistake, any miscalculation, could lead to an explosion that would bury the entire tunnel. At night, when the sound of the cars dies down and only the emergency lights remain, an eerie silence fills the tunnels. There is a distant cough, and the smell of oil and coal hangs in the air. The narrator feels that this place is no longer just a factory, but a living tomb, a place where science, war, and death are intertwined. Outside, in the cold European sky, the sound of Allied bombing can be heard on the horizon. The ground trembles, dirt falls from the roof, and the faint vibration of metal echoes in the air. At the end of that night, silence returns, but it is not the same. In the darkness of the tunnels, the few yellow lights have transformed the shadows into vague shapes. The narrator senses that here, in the heart of stone and iron, a future is being built that holds both glory and curse. A future that will be judged not by its creators, but by the heirs of war.
In the third part, the story moves beyond the tunnels, where the World War in its final years is drawing its last breaths with a cold, metallic roar. The winter of 1944 has arrived. Germany is retreating on various fronts, but a hidden hope still burns in the heart of the Reich. Miracle weapons. In advertising, newspapers, and noisy radio speeches, these new weapons are promised to change the course of the war. But behind the scenes, a more bitter truth lies. Science and madness are intertwined, and in secret laboratories, the line between progress and disaster has disappeared. In the heart of the Bohemian rainforest, the narrator describes a base that does not exist on the maps. Its narrow, muddy path winds through wet trees to a vast area with barbed wire fences. Concrete buildings are built half buried in the ground, with steel doors that open with a code. SS guards, with emotionless faces, watch the scientists as they pass by. Among them are names that will later be remembered in history, suspended between science and evil. Those with sharp minds and silent souls designing technologies that even they themselves fear for their true dimensions. In one of the main halls, the narrator sees a team of scientists gathered around a long table. On the table are small metal models of airplanes and missiles. On a large board, a drawing of a jet engine with coal and liquid fuel is drawn. One of the engineers explains that this project could produce a speed of twice the speed of sound of current airplanes. A cold silence fills the hall. Only the sound of chalk on the board can be heard. But outside the thick walls, the sound of Allied artillery booms in the distance. The narrator feels the time is running out, while inside these walls, the illusion of salvation still exists. At night, in another part of the same complex, a secret experiment begins. A group of engineers have gathered around the launch pad. In the center, a huge object of silvery metal is hidden under a gray cloth. The spotlights are turned on. Steam rises from under the pad, and the smell of fresh fuel fills the air. The narrator watches from afar in the shadows. The command to launch is given, and the ground shakes. The metal object is torn off with a terrible roar, rises into the sky, disappears among the clouds. There is a few seconds of absolute silence. Then a bright light illuminates the horizon. The blast wave is so powerful that the windows of the shelters tremble. In the control room, someone mutters, "We succeeded." But the narrator sees no joy in the tired eyes of the scientists, only emptiness, silent fear, and the sudden realization of the price that has been paid. Days later, news of Allied retaliatory attacks reach V-2 launch sites across Europe. Bombers have turned the skies of northern Germany into a sea of fire. Factories and laboratories are destroyed one by one. But even in the moments of collapse, new projects continue in the dark corners of the Reich. In one of the workshops, the narrator mentions the existence of a project codenamed Die Glock, a mysterious bell of heavy metal filled with unknown liquid, which, when activated, is said to alter time and space. He hears engineers whispering about vast magnetic fields and unexplainable forces. Some say the project has nothing to do with conventional physics, but rather straddles the line between science and myth. In the darkness, the narrator senses that this mad search for the ultimate weapon has transcended military logic. It has become faith, faith in salvation through destruction. In the stares of the SS officers, in the feverish eyes of the scientists, and in the long shadows of the concrete walls, there is something of apocalyptic madness. Germany, on the verge of collapse, is searching for a weapon that might be able to stop not its enemies, but history. And at that moment, the roar of airplane engines echoes in the sky, and the narrator knows that once again, fire will fall upon these secrets.
In Part 4, our narrator returns from the surface of the Earth and through the ruins of Europe to the darkest heart of the science of war, a place deep in the Alps where the Third Reich had hidden its last hope. It was called Valkyrie Süd, but no map showed it. Only a small circle of high-ranking officers and scientists knew of its existence. At this base, programs were underway whose goal was no longer to win the war, but to create something more than that, a power that could immortalize the name of Germany even after the fall of Berlin. From afar, in the cold shadows, the narrator describes the atmosphere there. Huge steel doors are sunk into the stone. The air inside the tunnels is filled with the smell of ozone and metal, and electric sparks flash through thick cables. The sound of huge engines and generators running non-stop echoes throughout the space, like the beating of an iron giant's heart. Inside one of the central halls, huge cylindrical tanks are lined up. Each is marked with warning signs and coded numbers. The narrator sees that on one of them, the words Project Morgan Star are written in red, Project Morning Star. Around these tanks, a group of scientists in long gray coats are taking measurements. The weak light of industrial lamps casts shadows on their faces. In the corner of the hall, SS officers, notebooks in hand, record everything without any emotion. The atmosphere in the room is filled with a tension that no one speaks of. The narrator sees that science no longer serves logic, but rather fear, fear of the end, of destruction, and of the question of whether man can control forces he does not understand. One day, the order is given to conduct a new experiment. All the lower-ranking personnel leave the hall. Only the senior officers and the chief scientists remain. The narrator is hidden in the shadows, and through the gray smoke of the machines, he sees the scene. In the center of the hall, a spherical object of black metal is mounted on a huge pedestal. Thick coils of wires surround it, and cables are connected to giant generators. One of the scientists orders the power to be increased. The buzzing increases, the lights flash, and the air around begins to tremble. Suddenly, a faint sound like air breaking fills the air, something like time being compressed in one spot. The temperature of the room suddenly drops. Breaths evaporate into the air. Then, from within the device, a faint but unstable light shines forth, a light that is neither white nor yellow, but something between two realities. The narrator feels the world stop for a moment. A heavy silence reigns, but in the eyes of one of the scientists, a flash of fear shines. "We have awakened something we do not yet understand," he mutters. Then, suddenly, an explosion erupts from within one of the generators. One of the cables catches fire, screams rise, and thick smoke fills the hall. Amid the din of sirens and shouts, the narrator sees officers trying to shut down the device. A bright light illuminates everything for a few seconds, and then total darkness. When the smoke clears, part of the device has collapsed and the ground around it has melted. No one knows exactly what happened, but later, in the reports, a term that had never existed in science before is used: divergent beam. A few days later, in Berlin, a report of the incident reaches headquarters. Some high-ranking officers demand that the project be stopped. But it is too late. In the wake of successive defeats on the fronts, all hope for the miracle weapon is dashed. The order is given to continue research with greater intensity. The narrator says that from this moment on, science no longer works towards victory, but towards escape from collapse. Amid this chaos, other projects are underway. Prototypes of disc-shaped aircraft, unmanned submarines, and weapons based on magnetic waves, the existence of which is still in doubt today. In another corner of the base, a small group of engineers are testing an engine that they say can run without conventional fuel. Amid the tools and cold metal, the narrator hears the weary voice of one of them say, "We work for the end, not for victory." A sentence that seems to be the epitaph of all the secret projects of the Reich. At night, when the tunnels are deserted, only the light of emergency lights shine on the walls and the sound of the wind rushing through the pipes. A deep silence prevails everywhere, a silence that seems to have buried a corner of history within itself. The narrator recalls the last image as follows. In a dark room, on a table is a map of Europe. The red lines of the fronts have reached as far as Berlin. Next to the map is a small metal device, part of the same failed project. The weary engineer looks at it with sunken eyes, then closes a notebook and says, "If we fail, the world will still fear us, even in the future." And the narrator knows that in this moment, science and terror are forever intertwined in history.
In the winter evening of 1945, the mountains are shrouded in thick fog. The underground bases are still lit by the yellow, flickering light of generators, but the sound of exhaustion can be heard from every concrete wall. The heavy air is filled with the smell of industrial fuel and hot metal. A layer of soot coats the ceilings, and from time to time you can hear the sound of condensed drops of steam falling onto the cold ground. Deep underground, where the walls are covered with bare wires and copper pipes, the latest experiments are being carried out. Workrooms stretch along long tunnels. Each room is filled with metal tables, half-burned tools, broken engine parts, and drawings drawn in pencil and charcoal on thick paper. On each sheet, there are signs whose meaning only their owners know. Clumsy equations, hastily drawn lines, half-baked ideas whose time for realization is past. The sound of ventilation fans mingles with the smell of damp stone, and the air tastes of metal with every breath. In one of the main halls, a huge machine with a nameless body stands. The body is made of heavy steel, with screws the thickness of a human finger. The surrounding walls are covered with a layer of lead. Industrial lamps overhead, struggling to filter light through the dust suspended in the air. In a corner of the hall, a control desk with motionless hands stands. The floor is covered with oil stains and the footprints of heavy shoes. Everything here bears the mark of haste and urgency. It's as if everyone knows the end is near, but they haven't stopped trying yet. The sound of a diesel engine comes from afar, a heavy sound, reverberating and vibrating through the tunnels. The walls respond, the metals vibrate. A blinding light shines through one of the iron doors. Hot air suddenly spreads into space. Steam rises and disappears into the ceiling. The platform trembles. An hour later, silence returns. A silence heavier than before. Only the sound of water dripping from the cooling pipes remains. In a corner of the hall, on the wall, faded posters of victory slogans still hang, but their glue has peeled off under the humidity and their corners are bent. On the ground, the wind blows through the bare trees. Snow settles on the concrete roofs, and the steam from the chimneys disappears into the air. A narrow road cuts through the forest, full of tire tracks, oil stains, and empty ammunition boxes. Unmarked trucks come in and out at night. Faces are scarcely visible, words are not exchanged, and every movement is made with a hidden fear. At the end of the path is a small shelter with steel doors. Behind that door are stacked wooden crates sealed with the emblem of the Reich Eagle. No one knows what is inside them. Perhaps blueprints, perhaps samples, perhaps something that must never be found. The weather is getting colder by the day. Snow piles up at the mouths of the tunnels, and the wind makes a howling sound through the metal structures. One by one, the generators fail. The yellow lights give way to the last flickering of the lamps. Below ground, a layer of vapor haze turns everything gray. On the ground, half-burnt pieces of machinery are left, as if someone had suddenly abandoned everything. A heavy silence reigns, a silence that smells of the end. All that remains is a trail of fuel vapor escaping through cracked pipes and disappearing into the air. On the horizon, the distant roar of airplanes can be heard. Faint lights move in the night sky. Snow falls, ceaselessly, settling on the ground stained with oil and ash. Everything seems lifeless, but within this silence, it seems as if secrets still live, among the silent machines, in the half-burned circuits, and in the plans still left on the tables, plans that once were supposed to build the future, but now are only relics of the mad ambition of man in the last moments of war.
Deep in the Alps, the snow was falling relentlessly. The winter of 1945 was swallowing up every sign of life. Everything was cold, silent, and gray. Even the air smelled of burnt metal and raw gasoline. Deep in the heart of the massive rocks, an underground bunker had been built, a structure neither on the maps nor known to anyone outside the narrow circle of commanders. Its entrance was hidden behind a layer of trees and boulders, and only a narrow, snow-covered path led to heavy steel doors. Inside the bunker, another world flowed. Concrete corridors stretched downward, where the air no longer smelled of dirt, but was filled with the flavors of electricity, smoke, and machine oil. The sound of ventilation fans mingled with the faint whir of diesel generators. Hidden deep within were halls, each a reflection of the crumbling government's last-ditch efforts to survive. In one, engineers hunched over drafting tables with stubby pencils and hands black with soot, still sketching lines that would never be completed. In another, the floor was littered with metal, wires, and the shattered frames of experimental aircraft. The walls were covered with papers covered with cryptic symbols, formulas, and illegible handwriting. Some were written in dried blood as if the papers themselves were part of some silent oath. On the center table lay a massive blueprint, a blueprint of some unknown device with parallel lines, intertwined loops, and chambers that strangely did not look like engines. Next to the map were several pieces of heavy black metal that did not absorb light. Their surfaces were smooth and shiny, but not reflective, as if they were made of a material that science did not yet know. In one corner of the hall stood a huge tank with copper pipes and thick wires. Its surface was covered with ice, and white steam rose from its corners. On the tank was written in red, Project Morgenrot, Project Dawn. No one explained it. The only rumor was that this project was supposed to be something that would turn the war upside down. In another part of the bunker was a room with lead walls and double doors. There was absolute silence. Only the occasional spark of circuits could be heard. The floor of the room was covered with thick cables and black boxes.
A small notebook was left open on one of the tables. The lines were scribbled on it in a hurry, equations about energy density, time, and variable magnetic fields. In the margin of the note was a sentence in German. Was wäre, wenn die Zeit selbst die Waffe wäre? What if time itself were a weapon? From time to time, heavy footsteps could be heard through the tunnels. Guards in thick clothes and rusted weapons passed by in silence. No one spoke to anyone. The looks were lifeless and tired. On the walls, posters from the early days of the Reich still remained. Slogans about glory, victory, the future. They were faded now. The paper cracked, and the corners creased with moisture. All that remained in the air was a sense of defeat. Not just military, but mental defeat. The defeat of faith in anything but survival. Deep in the northern part of the bunker, another device was ready for testing. Something between a massive generator and an electromagnetic cannon. Around it, cables clung to the walls like black roots. With each spark, a brilliant white light filled the entire space, and shadows ran across the walls. Several engineers were hiding in a corner, their faces pale. One of them pressed a button. Suddenly, a huge roar filled the air. The ground shook. The device began to spin, and in its center, a blue light formed, small but alive, like a heartbeat in the darkness. The light pulsed softly, each time stronger than before. The pipes began to tremble, the bolts loosened, and the floor of the hall rippled with the tremors. The engineers backed away. A few seconds later, there was a silent explosion. No sound, no flame, just a wave of air that invisibly passed through the hall, shaking everything. Then, silence. The machine shut down. The lights flickered and stayed shut. The only light that remained was the blue dot in the center of the machine, now the size of a human fist, brighter than anything around it. That dot of light hung in the air for a few minutes, motionless, silent. Then it slowly faded and disappeared. No one spoke. Only the sound of broken breaths could be heard in the steamy haze of space. When the power came back on, something remained on the ground, a burnt shadow on the floor of the hall, like a human footprint, but without a body. In the days that followed, the hall was closed. No one was allowed in. Official reports said that the machine had broken down and the project had been halted. But in the dark corridors, the smell of ozone and burnt metal still lingered. Some guards swore that at night a blue light shone from beneath the closed doors, a quiet, silent light that seemed to still be alive, a reminder of humanity's last attempt to master something it could never control.
Deep in the Alps, the snow was falling relentlessly. The winter of 1945 was swallowing up every sign of life. Everything was cold, silent, and gray. Even the air smelled of burnt metal and raw gasoline. Deep in the heart of the massive rocks, an underground bunker had been built, a structure neither on the maps nor known to anyone outside the narrow circle of commanders. Its entrance was hidden behind a layer of trees and boulders, and only a narrow, snow-covered path led to heavy steel doors. Inside the bunker, another world flowed. Concrete corridors stretched downward, where the air no longer smelled of dirt, but was filled with the flavors of electricity, smoke, and machine oil. The sound of ventilation fans mingled with the faint whir of diesel generators. Hidden deep within were halls, each a reflection of the crumbling government's last-ditch efforts to survive. In one, engineers hunched over drafting tables with stubby pencils and hands black with soot, still sketching lines that would never be completed. In another, the floor was littered with metal, wires, and the shattered frames of experimental aircraft. The walls were covered with papers, covered with cryptic symbols, formulas, and illegible handwriting. Some were written in dried blood, as if the papers themselves were part of some silent oath. On the center table lay a massive blueprint,
a blueprint of some unknown device with parallel lines, intertwined loops, and chambers that strangely did not look like engines. Next to the map were several pieces of heavy black metal that did not absorb light. Their surfaces were smooth and shiny, but not reflective, as if they were made of a material that science did not yet know. In one corner of the hall stood a huge tank with copper pipes and thick wires. Its surface was covered with ice and white steam rose from its corners. On the tank was written in red, Projekt Morgenröte, Project Dawn. No one explained it. The only rumor was that this project was supposed to be something that would turn the war upside down. In another part of the bunker was a room with lead walls and double doors. There was absolute silence. Only the occasional spark of circuits could be heard. The floor of the room was covered with thick cables and black boxes. A small notebook was left open on one of the tables. The lines were scribbled on it in a hurry. Equations about energy density, time, and variable magnetic fields. In the margin of the note was a sentence in German. Was wäre, wenn die Zeit selbst die Waffe wäre? What if time itself were a weapon? From time to time, heavy footsteps could be heard through the tunnels. Guards in thick clothes and rusted weapons passed by in silence. No one spoke to anyone. The looks were lifeless and tired. On the walls, posters from the early days of the Reich still remained. Slogans about glory, victory, the future. They were faded now, the paper cracked, and the corners creased with moisture. All that remained in the air was a sense of defeat. Not just military, but mental defeat. The defeat of faith in anything but survival. Deep in the northern part of the bunker, another device was ready for testing. Something between a massive generator and an electromagnetic cannon. Around it, cables clung to the walls like black roots. With each spark, a brilliant white light filled the entire space and shadows ran across the walls. Several engineers were hiding in a corner, their faces pale. One of them pressed a button. Suddenly, a huge roar filled the air. The ground shook. The device began to spin, and in its center, a blue light formed. Small, but alive, like a heartbeat in the darkness. The light pulsed softly, each time stronger than before. The pipes began to tremble, the bolts loosened, and the floor of the hall rippled with the tremors. The engineers backed away. A few seconds later, there was a silent explosion. No sound, no flame, just a wave of air that invisibly passed through the hall, shaking everything. Then, silence. The machine shut down. The lights flickered and stayed shut. The only light that remained was the blue dot in the center of the machine, now the size of a human fist, brighter than anything around it. That dot of light hung in the air for a few minutes, motionless, silent. Then, it slowly faded and disappeared. No one spoke. Only the sound of broken breaths could be heard in the steamy haze of space. When the power came back on, something remained on the ground. A burnt shadow on the floor of the hall, like a human footprint, but without a body. In the days that followed, the hall was closed. No one was allowed in. Official reports said that the machine had broken down and the project had been halted. But in the dark corridors, the smell of ozone and burnt metal still lingered. Some guards swore that at night, a blue light shone from beneath the closed doors, a quiet, silent light that seemed to still be alive, a reminder of humanity's last attempt to master something it could never control.
Days had passed since the ring had been turned off, but the silence of the bunker had not yet been broken. The main doors were closed, and the order had come directly from Berlin. No one is allowed to leave until a thorough inspection has been carried out. On the upper levels, the Allied forces were getting closer every day, but deep underground, a small group still continued to work in a space where the smell of hot metal, oil, and fear mingled. The temperature in the tunnels had dropped, steam rose from the vents, and the old generators continued to whine.
The engineers who remained could no longer tell day from night. The walls were covered with blackened fingerprints, and in the narrow passages between the halls, shadows from their movements slid across the damp walls. Amidst the silence, strange news spread. One of the guards had heard a sound from the ring hall the previous night, a sound like metal on metal, and then 3 slow knocks on the steel door. At first, no one believed it, but the next morning, when another officer went to investigate, he found fresh footprints on the damp floor beside the ring, footprints that had come from inside the hall, not outside. The door to the hall was ordered open. 4 men entered, wearing thick masks and carrying flashlights. The fog hung in the air, and the smell of ozone and burnt fuel still lingered. The ring stood silent, but traces of heat remained in its metal. The floor was charred, and irregular lines of blackness ran around it, like the mark of a lightning strike. Between those lines, something had fallen. A piece of cloth, thick and greasy, and blazoned with the Nazi insignia. But this cloth was not the kind used in the army. Its texture was different. It smelled peculiarly, something between industrial oil and damp dirt. They removed the object, but that night, one of the team members developed a fever. The hallucinations, delirium, and insomnia continued until morning. He said he heard voices coming from inside the walls, whispers in a language he didn't recognize. By dawn, he was dead. His body was cold, his skin was gray, and his eyes were open. There were no signs of wounds or suffocation. From that moment on, fear grew imperceptibly in the shelter. One by one, people disappeared. At night, footsteps could be heard, as if someone was wandering through the tunnels. The generators would sometimes turn off for no reason, and when they turned back on, the equipment had been moved, as if someone had tampered with everything in their absence. The remaining engineers talked about what they had seen: a shadow, amidst the flickering light of the lamps, silent, tall, and moving slowly. One night, a senior officer decided to reactivate the ring, to get an answer. He believed that something or someone had returned from the other side. That night, 4 people gathered in the hall. The device was turned on, the magnetic field came back to life, and the air was plunged into a slow vibration. Inside the ring, there was no light or image, only blackness, alive and moving. A sound arose from it, like breathing. The silence was broken. The lights went out, the sound of metal reverberated in the air, and something emerged from inside the ring. Not quite visible, not quite human. It took only a few seconds for the light to return, and when it did, no one was left but the officer. In the guard's office, his last note was found. On a greasy folded piece of paper, it read, "They never left. We just opened the way." After that incident, the order to evacuate was given. The bunker was abandoned in silence, the doors sealed with concrete, and its plans buried in the archives. Years later, when Allied forces arrived in the area, they found only a half-collapsed tunnel, with walls that still glowed faintly, as if something deep down was still awake.
The snow continued to fall, calm and steady. The shelter was buried under a layer of white, as if the earth wanted to hide everything within itself. But hundreds of meters below that cold silence, something was still alive. The last generator was working, with a muffled groan and an irregular rhythm, like the beating of a patient's heart in its last moments. In one of the forgotten sections of the shelter, at the end of a tunnel sealed with heavy doors, a few people still remained. Of the 40 engineers, only 5 survived. They lived in the damp darkness, with lights that grew weaker by the minute. The air smelled of rust and rot. The sound of water dripping from the cracked ceiling was wrapped in the silence. None of them knew what time it was anymore. Hours had no meaning at this depth. One of them, Heinrich, had taken refuge in his old notebook. The same notebook he had once kept to record the results of his experiments, now turned into a confessional. On the last page, he had written, "We thought we were building a time machine, but perhaps we opened the door to somewhere else, a place that shouldn't exist." That night, a bitter cold seeped through the walls. The weak flame of the torches flickered constantly. A faint sound came from afar, like regular blows on metal, like the gentle pounding of a sledgehammer, or perhaps footsteps. No one said anything. They just listened. An hour later, the main fuse blew. There was complete darkness. The only light that remained came from inside one of the side tunnels, a silent white light. The two men went forward to find its source, but after the first turn, a short scream was heard, then silence. Another survivor said he had seen something for a moment. Something formed in the mist of light, tall, moving very slowly, but unsteadily, like a shadow in water. Heinrich was left alone. In silence, he went back to the ring hall. Everything was there, but dusty and silent. The light of his lamp flickered on the metals. On the surface of the ring, lines were visible that had not been there before. Deep patterns, like burnt veins, so regular and precise that they could not have been the result of an accident. The lines, if seen from above, had a spiral pattern, as if something from within was trying to escape the ring. He approached slowly. On the ground, where the officer had disappeared, there was now something like a handprint. Not human, not mechanical, larger, more irregular and sunken into the metal. At that moment, the generator was turned on for the last time. A flickering light fell on the ring, and a sound like breathing filled the air. Heinrich looked at his notebook, picked up his pen, and wrote one last sentence. "If anyone finds this place, they are gone, but their emptiness still breathes." Then he looked at the device, he raised his hand, and pressed the power button. White light engulfed the entire room. A few seconds later, everything went dark. The generator burned out, the lights went out, and the bunker was plunged into darkness. Decades later, a group of military archaeologists excavated in the same area and found part of the concrete structure. The thick metal door with its rusted warning signs was still in place. When they opened it, warm air rushed out, as if something had survived there all these years. Amid the rubble was a burned notebook. The last page was half burned, but it was still readable. "We thought we had closed the door, but maybe we just opened it from the other side."
The snow was no longer falling. The sky was leaden and heavy, hanging like a silent blanket over the mountain. A cold breeze blew through the bare trees, and the sound of frozen branches rustled in the air. On the slope of a hill covered in dirt and ice, the entrance to a bunker was visible, half buried underground. The walls were cracked, and traces of rust had crept into the concrete like metal roots. Decades had passed. No one believed that anything remained in these depths. A group of military researchers, in protective suits and modern equipment, had come to investigate the legends. Legends about a lost project that was supposed to change the fate of the war. They set up the instruments, turned on the cold white lights, and crept slowly into the darkness. Inside the bunker, the air was heavy. The smell of dampness and burnt oil was still felt decades later. The floor was covered with dust, but the tracks of the chains and heavy wheels were still visible. One of the researchers shone his flashlight on the walls. Through a layer of blackness, writing appeared, sentences in a shaky line, written with what looked like charcoal. Some were in German, some were just meaningless, jumbled, repetitive lines. But in one corner, one sentence stood out more clearly than the rest. Sie sind nicht gegangen. They haven't gone. The researchers continued, speechless. In the narrow corridors, the sound of their footsteps echoed in the air. The lower they went, the warmer the air became. Suddenly, the beeping of one of the measuring devices increased. The radiation and magnetic fields were increasing. One of them said that they might be approaching the main section. A few minutes later, at the end of a long tunnel, they reached a huge steel door. It was still intact. The Reich's seal was visible on it, but rust and decay had half obliterated its outline. One of the members opened the door cautiously. The sound of heavy metal echoed through the air. Hot, humid air rushed out. The lights flickered. And there, in the center of the hall, stood the device, the black ring. Its surface was still shiny, as if freshly polished. Around it, collapsed cables and pipes could be seen, but the ring itself was intact. In the silence, the lights of the lamp glided over the black metal. One of the researchers stepped forward and said quietly, "This can't still be lighting after all these years." But the device suddenly shuddered. A faint buzzing sound echoed through the air. The hands of the measuring instrument spun wildly. The air grew heavy. The lights faded. And in the center of the ring, where there should have been only darkness, a faint light appeared. White, then gray, then colorless. The researchers took a few steps back. From within the light, a shadow appeared. At first vague, then clearer. It was human-sized, but its movements were slow and erratic, as if it were stuck in time. One of the members shouted that they had to get out, but at that moment, the machine began to vibrate, and a sound like 1,000 whispers rose from the hall. Voices that came from different languages, unintelligible and endless. The light suddenly went out. Absolute silence. All that remained was the heavy, trembling breathing of the survivors. Then, the sound of water dripping on metal was heard. One of the lights came back on, faintly and tremblingly. The ring was off. There were no shadows, but on the floor of the hall, fresh footprints could be seen. Dozens of footprints, all from within the ring towards the exit. When the rescue team arrived, hours later, all that remained of the first group was their equipment. The cameras were on, but no image was recorded except for a continuous sound of electronic noise. In the final seconds of the audio file, before the system completely burned out, only one sentence was discernible. A soft, drawn-out voice, as if from a great distance. Wir haben nie aufgehört. We never stopped. The bunker was sealed again. No one could say exactly what they had seen. But an unofficial report from a member of the second team, revealed years later, read, "The loop is still working. We didn't turn it off. We just closed our eyes."